This week on Quadriga, revelations in Rome, leaks shake the Vatican. Benedict XVI is on the defensive after confidential documents were leaked to the outside world. The Pope's papers have torn a huge hole in the Vatican's shield of secrecy. A new book details corruption, intrigue, and struggles. How far will the revelations go? The Pontiff's butler is under investigation. Is he a lone whistleblower trying to clean up the ancient Catholic institution? Or is he the pawn of powerful Vatican insiders trying to bring down the current Pope? Your host on today's show is Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. The Da Vinci Code was a best-selling book worldwide, but even Dan Brown could probably not have foreseen the events unfolding inside the Vatican these days. So, who leaked the documents, and more importantly, why? These are some of the questions we will address together with three individuals who know the Catholic Church and the Vatican very well. Welcome to John Berwick, who is the religious affairs correspondent here at Deutsche Welle. Alexander Gerlach is the founder and executive editor of the German online magazine The European. He also holds a PhD in theology. Ludwig Ring-Eifel is the editor-in-chief of the Germany-based Catholic news agency. A former Vatican correspondent, he has written several books about the Holy See. Well, Ludwig Ring-Eifel, the private correspondence of Pope Benedict XVI has been leaked. You've been at the Vatican for a long time. What surprised you the most? That the documents were leaked in the first place, or perhaps the content itself?
What surprised me most was the number of documents leaked. There have been documents leaked over the time now and again, but very small pieces of information. And this time you have dozens, you have hundreds of papers leaking through unknown channels to the outside world, and that's the real interesting thing here.
John Berwick, what surprised you the most about the documents?
What surprised me most is how little they actually reveal. It's interesting the way the media has responded to them. Of course, it's, journalists can't resist a Vatican whodunit, and your comparison with the Dan Brown novel I thought was a very good one. But actually, when one looks at the documents, there are allegations, suggestions that everything is not in order, there's suggestions of power play and so on, but there's very little actually concrete evidence of wrongdoing, anything that would stand up in a court of law, for example.
Alexander Gerlach, you have probably had a chance to look at the documents, some of them anyway. Now, everybody's wondering who did it. Now, of course, we know that the butler, Paolo Gabriele, is in custody right now, but he seems just a marginal figure, doesn't he?
We see and we know there is, since Pope Benedict ascended to the chair of St. Peter, that there has been a battle in the background who is really in reign of the things that go on in the Vatican. See, it's not the Pope. We think he's the last absolute monarch in the whole of Europe, but on the other hand, he's just representing, he's the face to the outside world, and behind that scene, there's many people who try to keep their influence, and let's say in terms of what we will speak about the Vatican Bank or other circumstances. The Catholic Church is a big institution, and the Pope is just one figure of them.
Indeed, the Vatican is a big institution, and Ludwig van Ring-Eifel, in the day and age of the Internet, are these kind of things perhaps even become inevitable, that the Vatican itself is no longer immune from such leaks?
Well, the funny thing about this Vati leaks, which Nuzzi showed in his book, Sua Santità, is that it's not an internet thing. It's very old-fashioned. The source, as he describes it in his book, got the documents on paper. He copied them, and they met outside the Vatican somewhere in Rome, and he gave them the papers. So nothing about the internet age here. Maybe the spirit of the internet age does play a role. You have younger people in the Vatican, and the butler is one of the very few younger people there. He's 46 years old. He's married. He's a normal man, I should say, whereas most of his superiors are elderly celibatarians in their 70s and 80s, and he's one of the few younger normal men in this surrounding. I guess he uses internet. He has friends who use the internet. He has heard about WikiLeaks and all that. And I think his idea was we need that kind of transparency in the Vatican too. And that's how he went about the leaking. That's my interpretation of why he did it.
Transparency, of course, a very important term in the context of the so-called scandal. John Berwick, the book that Ludwig Eiffel just showed us is by Gianluigi Nuzzi, of course, the Italian journalist. It's called His Holiness, The Secret Papers of Benedict XVI. Now, the Vatican now is threatening legal action against Nuzzi. Do you think that's a wise move?
Well, secreto in Italian, my Italian is not very good, but I understand can be translated also as either secret or private. The private secretary of the Pope is also referred to as secreto. No? The private archives of the Pope are referred to as secreto. Often in English it's translated as secret, and that gives a kind of aura of secrecy which actually does not correspond to the facts. I think what we have here is a case of private papers being published. And what I find missing in the whole discussion about this is the ethical question, I mean in the media, the ethical question of when is it legitimate or when is it somebody's moral responsibility to break trust, the trust of one's employers, and to publish private letters. I think the transparency question that you mentioned is really key to this whole discussion. Transparency, of course, is a kind of buzzword in the 21st century, WikiLeaks and so on. Various governments around the world have suffered from it. I myself was a civil servant in Britain 30 years ago and had to sign the Official Secrets Act. This is not something specific to the Vatican. Of course, there are code of conducts in every multinational, every company. On the one hand, the media talk often, we journalists talk about transparency as though transparency were a good in itself, that all transparency is good. I personally hold the view, perhaps controversially, that is naive. That in society there are people who are not benevolent. The great public is not simply a benevolent mass, and there are people who will use information against an institution malevolently. And therefore a decision has to be made about what should be revealed and what shouldn't be revealed. Just one small footnote to that is I think my own view is that the Vatican is overcautious in what it reveals. I think it could reveal a great deal more than it does. And sadly, in this particular case, I think this strengthens the hand. The media's reaction strengthens the hand of the conservatives who say, you see, Holy Father, we should be even more careful and less transparent. You see what happens when we admit any kind of failures at all.
And indeed, Alexander Görlach, Gianluigi Nuzzi said that his book is not a source of Pope bashing, that he did not intend to harm the Pope. Quite on the contrary, he sees the Pope as a rather progressive force within the Vatican. But the book had the opposite effect, didn't it?
Well, there's one thing, first of all, that scandals like these happened all the time over the course of history. And as you just said, it's not really the content of the letters. I mean, it's private correspondence, okay, but it didn't cause a real big bang in the Vatican or into other institutions the Vatican is related to. The thing is that we now try to combine is this scandal and the ongoing discourse, so to say, about who runs the Vatican. And we try now to link those two together, but it's not really sure right now if they really belong to each other. And the more interesting question to me is, what is the struggle behind the scenes in the Vatican? Who is really running the Vatican? They prepare for the next Pope, who is going to become the Pope. And there is like the network within the Vatican where the Pope himself, and there he is, in fact, a figure of a progressive figure when he attained power, that he just looked right through the structures in the Curia, which have been built up over the more than 20 years of John Paul II reign.
I think this is also a question of culture. I mean, he being a German professor, and he has this culture, the German culture, looking at things very thoroughly, abiding by the law, believing in the force of law. And then you have this Italian surrounding, which is a little bit different. And most of the 3,800 people or even 4,000 people who work in the Vatican are Italians, and they are embedded in the Italian culture, and this culture runs quite different from the German.
And we will talk in more detail about the disproportionate influence, if you will, of Italian cardinals within the Vatican. But I do want to come back to one point that John Berwick mentioned, namely the Pope's criticism towards the media. Is that a case of killing the messenger?
Yes and no. I mean, he has a point, the Pope has a point when he says that this is something that is hurting me personally. If my personal butler steals my personal documents and gives them to the press or to an author, that is illegal in any state, in any company, in any place in the world.
But can we blame the media for reporting on those documents?
I think we can blame them for not respecting the privacy. Nuzzi, in his book, takes a very radical approach. He even reproduces photocopies of personal writings in very personal matters, and I think there he's exaggerating. Of course, he has the right to do it. He's covered by the freedom of press in Italy, but I don't think that he has the moral right to do that.
And John Berwick, Nuzzi has said over and over again that, of course, he won't reveal his sources. What do you make of that?
Well, it's his right, of course. It's the traditional right of journalists not to reveal their sources. I personally think that it's not only ethically very questionable, as you've just said. Certainly in Germany it would be legally very questionable. I'm not myself a lawyer, but you would have to establish that this was in the public interest that you printed somebody else's personal correspondence. And I think in this particular case, as I say, if one looks at the actual documents, it's very difficult to prove that. If the documents included something like proof of corruption at some high level of a particular cardinal, then of course there'd be an entirely different matter. In a case like that, somebody has, I would argue, an ethical responsibility and also a legal right, of course, to steal the document and make it public. But we're not dealing with that kind of situation.
Well, there's some of that in the book. I mean, the letters on the sacking of Cardinal Vigano, who was the governor of Vatican State.
Can we talk about that? I would take issue with you about that. Why do you think that is proof of criminal action?
No, I'm not saying this is proof of criminal action. I'm saying this is something of public interest, because he was the governor of Vatican State. He cleared a lot of the corruption. He saved like 40 million euros a year to the Vatican. He did a great job, and he was transferred to Washington as a nuncio as a result. So this matter is of public interest, and the background of that, behind the scene, is of public interest.
I would just take issue with a few things there. I think the letter that Vigano writes to the Pope, that is published in Nuzzi's book, of course, it's I think a little different from the way that it's being reported in the media generally. If I recall rightly, what he actually says is he refers to the fact that he's cleaned up the very messy finances of the Vatican, in which a great deal of money was probably being wasted. One doesn't know. There may also have been, of course, a certain amount of corruption or people actually stealing and so on. It's possible, but that's not actually said. But he says he's got the Vatican finances onto even keel, and says this would be a very bad signal, is what he says, I think, when if I quote correctly, a very bad signal if just at this moment I were to be transferred. That's a legitimate thing for any employee to say, and it's quite understandable when one has done a good job and is being praised for it. He was not dismissed. His career is not at an end. He's got probably the best, the most ambassadorial post that the Vatican has to offer.
Well, there's one thing about this. We speak about a concept of public, and there is certain kind of papers we talk about. And there's a similarity to papers that, for instance, Chancellor Merkel would write, and they would have some notes on it. And of course, they are in the circle of the administration, and there's many moments where it could be leaked to a certain public. So the Pope is a public figure. I would say and follow your argumentation, when there is a letter the Pope writes to his brother and he writes about his health condition, or vice versa, I wouldn't say this is something that the public should definitely get in handwriting of the Pope. I would argue would be on your side. On the other hand, even this is a public issue, because the Pope is the Supreme Pontiff of 1.2 billion Catholics on the whole planet, and he is a public figure. So, of course, getting these letters and doing something with them is it's the obligation of a journalist. However, you always can argue how much you go in detail, how much you present, as you said, the handwriting of the Pope himself.
Well, of course, one name that hasn't been mentioned here so far is a very pivotal one in this so-called scandal, namely that of the Secretary of State in the Vatican, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone. Many people, Ludwig Ring-Eifel, would even say that he is the main target of these leaks. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree that the sources of this book had really Bertone as a target, because most of the documents are anti-Bertoni. They reveal how Bertoni is ruling the Holy See as a kind of premier of the Pope, and that he's doing this in a rather rude and sometimes also inefficient way. They do not portray him as a criminal or as somebody who's corrupt, but he ends up being far from sympathetic.
Well, certainly the
figure.
documents show him to be somebody who blocks the fight, the attempts to fight corruption and nepotism within the Vatican. John Berwick, was this role of the Cardinal, of the Secretary of State, known prior to leaking the documents, at least to the inner circle?
I don't belong to the inner circle, but it was certainly known to me. It's been an open secret for at least 5 years that Cardinal Bertoni is regarded by many Vatican analysts, I would say most, as being a man who is out of his depth. He's a Salesian priest. And I think when I think of Bertoni, I often have to think of St. John Bosco, the founder of the Salesians, who in his very famous statement said, "Be merry, do good, and let the sparrows chirp." And this is, from a certain point of view, this is very charming. But it's a man who has enormous power, of course, in the Vatican. This is not somehow secret power. This is part of the structure of the Vatican. He is the Secretary of State. The Cardinal Secretary of State is, as you said, virtually the Premier, but much more than the Premier as well. He also organizes, is the administrative head. And with a Pope like Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, who is an academic, as we all know, and a man who was a very spiritual man, I think he was very relieved, I have the impression, to give the whole administrative task to Bertoni and say, get on with it, you do it. Many people think that this was a serious mistake of the Pope's, and that he almost certainly has put the wrong man in this position. But as Mr. Ring-Eifel was saying, there's no sign, there's no evidence at all that he acted with any kind of corruption. There is the suggestion that he is somewhat incompetent.
And he contributes to the system. I mean, we all, I guess, agree that when Joseph Ratzinger became Pope, he was really eager to change structures within the Curia.
Yes.
And we already spoke about the Italian influence within that structure, and making an Italian head of the structure, of course, doesn't really, how can I say, it's not the most helpful way to achieve your purpose.
But still, I mean, when he chose Bertoni, he chose him as an outsider. He's one of the very few secretaries of state who has not been a diplomat before. So he does not come from this structure, but he brought him in from the outside, because before he was secretary of Joseph Ratzinger when he was a cardinal. So he is one of his few trusted old friends. But it seems he was not able to do the job.
Do you foresee that the Pope might perhaps, amid these allegations and revelations, might be prone to sack Bertoni?
No, I don't think so. That would be unprecedented. The Secretary of State is really the other half of the Pope. And sacking him would be admitting that he committed such a big error in picking him in the first place. Once in the 90s when he was a secretary in the Congregation of Faith, and then again when he picked him as Secretary of State when he became Pope. That is, no, I cannot even imagine that he would do that. What he might do is having him leave office when he turns 78. He's 77 now. When he's 78, he will have fulfilled his first 5 years term. So that would be a normal point to, and 78 is already quite an old age, and the Pope himself is 85. So yes, there would be even normal reasons to call a younger man to get the job done.
And Alexander Gerlach, the Pope is indeed 85 years old, and the documents seem to suggest that he doesn't have his house in order, that he might not even be the one calling the shots without the Vatican. What would you say? Well,
I guess I'm totally agree with the other two here that this is really pointing to Bertone. It's not really about the Pope. However, as Ludwig Ringeifel said, it would weaken the Pope very, very much if Bertone gets sacked. However, we have to have a look at the Pope, and when we speak about his age, we already speak about who is going to be the next Pope. And when John Paul II became Pope, when Karol Wojtyła became Pope, he started to transform the Curia and the cardinals in a more international kind of committee, so to speak. So, and the reality of the Catholic Church is that it is growing in every place on the planet but Europe. So to represent the whole body of the Catholic Church, of course, within the Vatican structures, there is influence from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, and the Italians who traditionally and for centuries had to run the place because back in the days, remember when we had no planes and stuff. Of course, it fell to the Romans to do that, and it's also their pride and their you know, they really like to do that in a very express it in a very positive way. But the Curia and the Vatican changed over the last half century, and it will go on changing. And so now, when you said his house isn't in order, we speak about who is the one who is going to clean up what is not in order.
So would you say then it's a desperate attempt on the part of Italian cardinals to hold on to their influence within the College of Cardinals?
Well, of course. I mean, this is natural and this happens in every structure. I don't see why the Catholic Church would be different from every other angle of the planet. And don't forget, when Karol Wojtyła became Pope, Italian newspapers were really nasty about him, just saying, oh, there's like some Polish wind. One of the newspapers wrote, I remember slightly saying, there's some Polish wind within the streets of Rome. So they were really not very fond of a foreigner as Pope. And I suggest that the next Pope will not be European, after all. He will be from another continent. So this will shaken up the whole industry a bit more.
I completely disagree that,
yes, so do I.
that there are Italian cardinals behind this book or behind the revelations. They might be the ones who get some positive effects from that. That might be, but they are not behind it.
Yes, I think also the idea that we could give here, unintentionally, I think, a false impression to the viewer that, of course, there are national interests and national pride, but there's also for the Church, for the Universal Church, there's also a huge advantage in having people from a small, politically unimportant country as in senior positions in the Church. It was, whatever one says about John Paul II, it was not uncontroversial to have a pope from Poland, particularly at the time when the Cold War was still going on. And in a similar sort of way, there are, to have, for example, an American pope would be a very, very complicated situation, not only for that particular person to distance himself from his own country and national interests, but it would also be for the Church as a whole, I think, rather difficult.
Just to make that clear, to me, the connection between the book and the general discussion we now have about the Vatican and the successor of Josef Ratzinger one day is not linked. Okay. I'm not so convinced yet that those, as I pointed out earlier, that those two cases really belong to each other in a very large extent.
Okay.
And Ludwig Ringeifel, the question is, we've seen in the book that the Vatican is to a certain extent at least, infiltrated with lies, intrigues, and bitter feuds, if you will, of rival parties. So in a sense, is the Vatican, if you like to say, an institution like any other political spectrum and party out there?
In some parts, yes, it is. Most of all in the part that is called the Vatican State. I mean, you have to make this distinction. There's the Vatican State, which is a small state, a territory that has a certain budget, like any small state like Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or other small states in Europe, even smaller than them. And then there you have the Holy See, which is something very different. And the real problem is, for me, the Holy See, because the Holy See, as the word says, is holy, or is meant to be holy. That meaning this is not just another state, it is not a worldly thing, but it is the thing that was created to help the successor of St. Peter. So it's if you find corruption or intrigues or conspiracy in this realm, then you would have a problem. But the book, as you mentioned, John, mostly points to Vatican State, to the small entity where the money is and the worldly affairs are. The Holy See may get out of all of this with minor
damage.
Well, that is interesting what you say, because in the very beginning you spoke about how does the internet or the digital age change the Vatican, and I guess what you said, the Vatican State will undergo changes. I mean, a few years ago there was a big innovation in the Vatican radio, so they got the latest technologies. A few years ago, when you corresponded with some guys in the administration, they wouldn't even have own a proper email address. So we you know what I mean. This is like there is a lot of things to do without just coming to higher theological questions about the nature and of the body of the church. It's really administration, and I guess in the next years we will see, also because of that scandals, a new kind of other kind of working. However, the distinction between the sacred sphere and the earthly sphere, like St. Augustine would say, the civitas Dei and the civitas terrena, I don't think this, I mean, we most of the time speak of the same people who embody this and that side. So, and they change sides, vice versa. So, to me, it's not, I do not make wonder that there is also sin and stuff going on also on the holy side of the Holy See. I guess we have seen that over the course of history. We have seen holy and saint popes, and we have seen others.
But John Berwick, could the leaks, could the revelations not have the opposite effect, if you will, that the Vatican will become, will intensify, if you will, the culture of secrecy?
Yes, I think that is a danger. Certainly, the people who think that that admitting any human failure will be exploited by the media to discredit the entire institution and perhaps even Christianity itself, the church itself. People who see it that way, of course, are likely to retreat into their shells like tortoises. And that I find very sad, but I can also understand it. I'd like to make a point, though, just very briefly about this distinction that I think is very interesting that Mr. Ringeichel talked about, the Holy See on the one hand and Vatican State. It's a very complicated relationship, and I think it goes far beyond this discussion to get into the details of that as such. But I think that I agree with him, if I understood him correctly, that the Pope at least appears so far from the documents that we've seen at the moment to come away from this extremely well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that, if I can just quote one particular case to say, to substantiate what I'm saying here, there is a case of an Australian bishop, William Morris, who disagrees theologically with the Pope and with the Roman Curia on a number of very significant issues. And as would happen in any large organization, in a case like this, he was called to task to answer himself. He defended himself. The Pope decided to see him personally and had a whole discussion with him. And then, to cut a long story short, the man was virtually forced to resign as bishop.
After 5 years or so.
That's right. It took a long time, and there was lots of discussion. He was forced to resign. When he was forced to resign, he then went public, virtually, at saying, I did not intend to resign. I had a discussion with the Pope, and this is all I was forced to do it. We have in these secret documents, these scandalous documents, we have a letter from the Pope saying, I feel guilty about this. I think it's he says in a very charming, humble way, I think it's probably my poor English that I misunderstood when talking to him. I thought that we were in agreement that it would be a sensible thing and a good thing for all people concerned for him to resign as bishop and to remain a priest. And then the Pope goes on to praise the man's good qualities and to say what an honest and good person he is.
And you see that Benedict XVI really made some changes within the organization when he met with Hans Küng, when he now addressed at High Thursday the critics in Austria. He has another way, as even John Paul II had with the critics in the theology of liberation. So we see that it's not that one day when the reign of Benedict is over, he wouldn't have done nothing. He really changed a lot within the system already.
So would you say then that he's a rather progressive force?
Oh, because
there are voices out there who would dispute that.
Well, of course, but now what are we talking about? Do we talk about the liturgy of the church? Do we talk about the moral teaching of the church? Now we spoke about the administrative body and how to reign, how to understand your office. When the Williamson scandal was out, the Pope said, okay, if we had used the internet properly, we would not have had this mess. He didn't say mess, but he meant it. So we cannot imagine half a century ago a Pope saying that. Remember John Paul I when he wanted to address the crowd when he was named Pope, the ceremony, I would just not allow him to take the microphone to say something to the crowd. It was John Paul II who did it for the first time. So this is the framework in which we speak and we talk.
And Ludwig Ring-Eifel, one aspect of the revelations, of the leaks, or perhaps not, has been the dismissal of the Vatican bank director, Ettore Gotti Tedeschi. Everybody is wondering if his dismissal is somehow interconnected with the book and the leaks. What do you make of this?
I doubt it very much. I think this is a coincidence that both happened in the same week. And from the book, we get some interesting insights on what Gotti Tedeschi did and mostly on what he did not do. And it seems to me that he was really fired because he did not do his job. He wrote long letters to the Pope and to the Secretary of State about the situation of the world economy and how the Vatican should react to all this. But he didn't take care of the Vatican Bank, which he was supposed to do. He never showed up there. He never went to his office. And that was an obvious reason to get him fired.
But John Berwick, the leaks do reveal differences over financial transparency within the Vatican. Would you agree with Mr. Ring-Eifel that it's just a coincidence that Tedeschi was dismissed shortly before the leaks were published?
To my knowledge, yes. As I understand it, it was the supervisory board of the bank that actually dismissed him because he was had been given very explicit instructions during his time also to increase the transparency of the bank and particularly to look into allegations of money laundering, which was going on allegedly at the bank. And the supervisory board, as Mr. Ring-Eifel said, were of the opinion that he was spending far too much time looking at global economics and not doing his homework. I don't think it's related to the leaks at all. It's interesting, though, that the Pope himself has also pushed for more transparency at the bank. I think, again, this is a good example of where, in my interpretation, this is much more a question of worldly incompetence at the Vatican than of active corruption. I may be myself naive in my reading of it this way, but I think the Church quite typically is perhaps of its very nature. It pushes people to the top, to very senior positions, who are theologians, who often have very little understanding or none at all about how finance works, who don't understand things like the euro crisis and so on. Heaven knows, I don't either. But they get to very senior positions, even a diocesan bishop. We've seen this in Berlin. That the previous cardinal, the last cardinal in Berlin, ultimately responsible for the finances of the Berlin diocese, made some very, very bad decisions. He himself later admitted it. The diocese got into terrible financial problems, had to be bailed out, and so on. And his answer to that was to write a letter saying to all his parishioners, an open letter saying, "I'm terribly sorry about this. I take responsibility for it. Please, can you make donations?"
Well, Alexander Gerlach, one person who will probably not be bailed out anytime soon is the former personal butler, Paolo Gabriele. But there's another person very close to the Pope, isn't it? His personal secretary, Georg Genswein. What do you make of his role?
Well, I mean, he is with Josef Ratzinger for quite some time already in his former position at the Congregation of Faith. And of course, the personal secretary is a person who, this is the door everybody has to go through when he wants to speak to the Pope and wants to be seen by the Pope. So he's a central figure, of course, for the Pope. And one day, Benedict XVI will not be Pope anymore. He will have to leave the Vatican because every private secretary has to do it because their power is so massive that if they would stay, they could, of course, influence the whole reign of the successor, of the then died Pope.
But you wouldn't say he doesn't have any role to play or any involvement in these leaks?
He has an important role in the book. That's absolutely fascinating to see how all the people who have suffered from some kind of injustice or who feel that they have suffered, all the victims, who do they turn to? They turn to Genswein. They write a letter to Genswein. They call him and say, "Can I send you a fax?" And they make up a time, and he gets the fax personally, and he reads it and he gives it to the Pope, and the Pope tries to find remedy for the things that happen. He, to me, Genswein in the book is a very sympathetic figure. He's the kind of person who helps the victims.
And John Berwick, for somebody who might not be so familiar with the inner workings of the Vatican, explain to us the difference between Georg Genswein's role and that of Bertone.
Well, it's interesting that the Pope's private secretary, Georg Genswein, in this case, has a very powerful role. It's an unofficially powerful role, and but it's a very traditional one. The Pope's personal secretary is usually the person who actually stands at the door, seeing who gets access to the Pope. So they have considerable power, in fact, and they often end up, after the Pope dies, they often become then a bishop and are given a diocese to get them out of Rome, but also they are people who hold considerable influence in the Church. Bertone is in a completely different category, but Bertone is officially responsible for the administration, and as I suggested earlier, he appears to be out of his depth. I mean, that would be my summary of the situation. He has already offered his resignation to the Pope, not in connection with this book. This was a few years ago, and I think it's just a question of time that he needs to be replaced by somebody who's more competent.
And one thing, also the private secretary has not only friends within the Vatican. I mean, this is just to give you a brief example. When the former assistant to Josef Ratzinger. Josef Ratzinger was over 70, so this farmer says, well, what I'm going to do? So he was made bishop, and he's now in one of the congregations. Then Don Giorgio, as they called him, came into office, and oops, Josef Ratzinger became the Pope. And then, of course, this former assistant, with all his network and all the people relying on him and all this network, you know what I want to say. Now, this was just like a mistake to leave the office at Ratzinger, because I guess the former assistant thought, okay, when Josef Ratzinger turns 75, and he knew he wants to write books, and the Pope will just let him go, so what am I going to do in the Vatican? So, of course, we have a whole branch of people who were now, they're just like sidetracked now. And this is always a conflict of interest.
Ludwig Ringeifel, we're running out of time, but I do want to put this issue in a greater context, if you will. Do you think that these leaks will contribute to an overall decline, if you will, a further decline of the Catholic Church? I mean, the Vatican obviously has been rocked by a sex abuse scandal and so on and so forth. Do you think that this is just another brick in
No, I think it's the usual crisis thing. Crisis is always two-sided. Crisis is a time of decision. And either the thing goes down or it goes up. And I think that, as we already said in this discussion, that the Pope himself and the papacy itself could come out of this strengthened, purified, if you wish. The Vatican could get out of this becoming a more transparent institution, doing a better communication job than they did before. That is my hope. I don't think it'll, in the long run, that it'll be a huge damage for the Church.
So no scars for the Vatican in the long run?
I'm a little less optimistic about that. I don't think that, as I've said, I don't think that the substance of the allegations of the book are of the nature that they will permanently damage the Church. And I think they could even contribute, as Herring Eiffel suggests, to greater transparency. But a lot depends on actually how the media react, whether they react responsibly or not. And I think there is also a tendency to exaggerate the scandals, and that could have a very negative effect.
Alexander Göller?
We see that John Paul II and Benedict XVI are, in terms of the state of the Vatican, not the best leaders a state can get, because they are, as we heard, spiritual figures. Coming to the papacy, if you go on from John the 23rd, till now, we have for more than half a century very sainted popes, so to speak. They were really good figures, charming figures. They might be hard in some moral attitudes or ideas, but as popes, they really represent a papacy that will make it through the whole 21st century.
Well, they made it through the 20th century, that's for sure. Let's see if the Vatican makes it through another one. Chances are they will. Thank you all out there for watching, and thank you to my guests. We look forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.